Hello everyone, good afternoon. Yes, this webinar is recorded for our reference. Good afternoon once again. My name is Mona Aika and I'm a child protection specialist in UNICEF East and Southern Africa Regional Office. A very warm welcome to all the government representatives who have managed to join us today. Changing the way we care colleagues, UNICEF child protection colleagues in East and Southern Africa. I'm also seeing colleagues joining in across the other region, West and Central Africa. A very warm welcome to all of you, UNICEF staff, and of course to the CSO partners working in the area of childcare reform in the region and beyond. We are all very much welcomed. As Emily mentioned, there is a simultaneous interpretation in French and in Portuguese. Please do take advantage of that service. And you can click, I think, Emily, there is a slide, but you can click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen and select the language you want to tune in to. So that's that. So before we start, just a quick overview of some webinar rules to hopefully enable us to have a smooth and lively session. If you haven't done so already, we're encouraging all the participants to introduce yourselves in the chat box by typing your name, your job title, and the country that you're working from or representing today. So this will help us know who is on the call and keep a register of interested participants so that we can keep running these sessions. And also, I'm reminding all participants to mute your microphones during the sessions, and you are encouraged to type in any comment or question that you may have in the course of the various presentations and discussions. We will also take all questions towards the end, so you'll have an opportunity to raise your hand and come in directly to intervene. Just a little overview of what this learning platform is all about. So the regional learning platform on childcare reform, established by UNICEF SRO, as we call it in short, East and Southern Africa Regional Office. This was done in collaboration with Changing the Way We Care, our partners, and the purpose really is to facilitate learning on childcare reform across East and Southern Africa region. We of course do open and welcome others from other regions and across the world to join us should they be interested to learn more on what is happening in the region. The management of the platform is supported by a consultancy firm, Child Frontiers. All of you have seen Emily. You can wave your hand, and the team and Bertha and others that are on the call from Child Frontiers who are supporting us in this work, and Emily is the lead consultant of this work. The learning platform on care, as I mentioned earlier, is in place to really provide an opportunity for governments in the region, UNICEF staff, and CSOs working in the area of care to share learning and experiences on implementing childcare reform programs. This platform began towards the end of 2020, and we called it phase 1. And we are currently in phase 2, which will run up to 2023. And of course, we've managed to secure some resources, many thanks to USAID, Displaced Children and Orphans Fund for their support in making this learning platform operational. So the platform will be running up to January 2023, phase 1, but then we will continue this up to towards the end of 2023. So that's great news. The learning on this platform is mainly facilitated through webinars. We have small group exchanges, practitioner webinars. You'll see towards the end, we'll let you know what are the new and latest production that's available in terms of videos and papers. And various topics that are covered include aspects of foster care, today's kinship care, kafala, and also lessons learned from COVID-19 and care. So we have all this in place. And we normally record these sessions for your reference so that you can play back whenever you need to watch the session again. We also have a help desk, what we call a help desk, but it's basically an email, my email or Emily's email shared at the end. So in case you have any question on childcare reform, you write to us and we will respond, appropriately, depending on the question that you have asked. We also produce monthly newsletters, which cover and provide content on what the learning platform has covered so far, and also advertises future learning sessions. So for today's webinar, as you already know, is on kinship care. And as we all know, being in East and Southern Africa.
Can you hear anything, Dagna?
Can you hear me? Hello? Gillian, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay.
Yes.
I think
we can hear you fine, Mona,
Yeah.
but I think somebody else just didn't have themselves on mute, so I'll try and mute them now. Please,
okay,
please carry
the
on.
interpreters can. Okay, so today's are the interpreters able to hear me? Are you hearing the interpretation in French and Portuguese for those that have tuned in? Please put your thumb up. Interpreters, can you hear me?
Ben, your interpreter, hearing you very well.
Okay,
just need to slow down a little bit. Sure,
thank you. Thank you for confirming that, and I will slow down. Today's webinar is on kinship care, a care mode that we use in Africa. And of course, it's also practiced elsewhere, where the care is being provided, the care of children is provided by extended family or friends of the family. And as we know, this is the most common form of alternative care in the region. And we also know that it's not yet, or at least it's not very well supported. So this webinar will explain why it is vital to invest on kinship care. And we'll also have an opportunity to hear some of the promising practices that are coming out from the region and beyond on what's working in implementing kinship care services. We will start the webinar with a presentation that will set the scene on kinship care in Africa as a continent, an asset worth supporting, which will cover what kinship care is all about and zoom into the current neglect of kinship care. We'll then get an introduction to the available guideline that is in place. And then after that, we'll go through a moderated panel of expert discussion from the region who will provide us with some insights on kinship care programs in the region. Emily will introduce the panelists, but they're coming from Kenya from South Africa, Zimbabwe. So we'll get to have a good mix of Eastern and the Southern part of the region. Just as a reminder, we'll take all the questions at the end, but feel free to ask or to type in a question or comment that you have in the course of this of the various presentations. Without further ado, let me pass the floor to Emily to introduce the next speaker. Thank you. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Mona. I'm just before we do that, I'm just going to launch our poll and ask that you spend just 1 minute asking 2 extremely short questions about where you work and who you work for. And if I could just ask you to keep yourselves on mute as well, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Brilliant. So while you're filling in that poll, I'm just going to introduce Gillian Mann, who's a fellow consultant at Child Frontiers and led on this research on kinship care in Africa. And
fick du det till?
Sorry. I'll just try and mute that. Yeah, I'll try and just mute that. I have muted them already, but they keep going off mute. There we go. It's okay. They're off mute, on mute now. This research was carried out for Family for Every Child, which is a network of NGOs working on care and protection issues all over the world. And we also have Gemma Gillam on from Family for Every Child, who's going to speak as well at the end of Gillian's presentation. So thank you for completing that poll. Those of you that done so, I will just end it and share the results briefly so that we can have a record of them. And I will hand over to Gillian to begin her presentation. Thanks very much.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Super, super. Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I am just going to launch my slides. Here we go. Can you see those?
Yes, we can.
Visible?
Yeah, it's looking
Super.
good. Yes, thank you.
Great, thanks. So I just wanted to take you through a very short presentation which reflects the findings of a paper that Emily and I wrote for Family for Every Child, as she mentioned.
I can hear it.
The picture on the left is great. The picture on the left is just a shot of what the report looks like to draw you in and encourage you to have a deeper read. And I just wanted to lay out briefly what I'll be talking about, which are three main points. The first is, why is it important to support kinship care? What support is needed? And how can this support be provided? The results of the research that I'm sharing here are on the basis of a literature review, but also country studies that took place in Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Liberia, Ghana, Kenya, and South Africa. And we have both Blessing from FOST in Zimbabwe and Suzanne from Cindy in South Africa here on the call, and they were involved in the primary data collection in their respective countries. So if you have specific questions with respect to anything that I say about their work, please direct it towards them at the end of the presentation. Great. So in terms of the first question, which is something that I don't think any of you really need convincing about, which is why support kinship care? I wanted to just give an indication about the findings from this research. The first is that it's pretty loud and clear that, as Mona said, kinship care is a nearly universal practice across the continent, at least in sub-Saharan Africa. It's present in many parts of the world, but it is the dominant means of looking after children in sub-Saharan Africa. It happens in almost every context, rural and urban, in many different types of families. It takes many different forms. For example, elder siblings looking after younger siblings, grandparent care, friends of the family. And this is a long-standing practice that has happened for a very long time. Importantly, the practice is underpinned by social norms related to care and reciprocity. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But I bring it up here to suggest that this is an Indigenous practice, as all of you know, that can be supported, and a form and function that is much needed on the continent and elsewhere. In fact, in Rwanda, for example, it's 200 times more likely that a child will be found in kinship care than he or she will be found in residential care. Those kind of statistics predominate across the continent, even in Zimbabwe, where 26% of children live without one or both biological parents. Children can be found in kinship care. It's a means of looking after children that is considered so ordinary that in many communities, it is understood to be normal care, and a number of people who were involved in this research in Kenya suggested that it shouldn't even be labeled as anything other than family care. Finally, kinship care is a form of care for children that is widely acknowledged in all kinds of national and international regional legislation and policy. It seems very well understood, and there is great consensus that there is a lot of potential in this means of caring for children. one of the things that's so terrific about kinship care is the fact that it's such a sophisticated mechanism of support. It represents a means of providing social support to children and families that is very sophisticated, in part because it takes such different forms, but also because it adapts itself to contexts as required. One of the things that many people talk about when you speak to caregivers and children themselves about kinship care is they mention its many benefits. For children, they talk about things like basic needs, material well-being, access to schooling, healthcare, other services, but importantly, talks about the provision of a loving environment, safety and protection for children who live without their parents, and a sense of belonging to a wider network of family. And one of the things that is little discussed in the literature, but which emerges pretty strongly from research, is how this mechanism of care for children is a very effective means of maintaining family bonds for children and for their caregivers. So when those bonds have been severed or are to some extent challenged, this is a mechanism for children to maintain those. In terms of benefits for caregivers, there is a great deal of practical support that children provide in such circumstances. Also, there's companionship and love. One of the things that comes out loud and clear from research with caregivers, particularly older caregivers and grandmothers in particular, who are the most likely to provide care across the continent, is the sense of achievement and a contribution to the development of the next generation. And many caregivers talk about that as very important. Similarly, they talk about how this form of care enables them to maintain connections to the broader family as well through the child and through his or her broader social networks. Finally, as I mentioned, the kinship care takes many different forms in different contexts. And it's very important to talk about the means in which it reflects a norm related to both reciprocity and care, that we are individuals, yes, but we are connected through social bonds, love, connection, and family bonds. And then kinship care is a means of connecting family and enhancing these networks over time and in the immediate term. I guess one of the things that's important to talk about is who provides care to children. And this is very much context dependent and also dependent on the age and the gender of the child, as well as the capacity of available caregivers to provide the kinds of care that are needed to children in specific circumstances. As I mentioned, grandparents and usually grandmothers are the most likely to provide care, but many others also step into this role, including aunts, uncles, older siblings, and friends of the family. Most often, these caregivers are female. That is a reflection of norms related to who provides care, but also to the reality that in many parts of the continent, male migration is a regular feature of life for families, and those who are remaining in particular community settings are often female and most available to provide this care. Arrangements in relation to providing kinship care are usually made between relatives, usually without any regulation or oversight from any external body. And parents may have more or less involvement in children's upbringing when a child is placed in the care of relatives or family friends. In some settings, children provide a great deal of support, and in other, parents provide a great deal of support to children being cared for by relatives, but in others, they have little to no involvement. And this just depends on the individual circumstances of each family. It's also really important to say that although placement is a kind of expected part of childhood and a normal part of childhood for many children in the region, it's important to say that it can also place boys and girls at risk, and that in this way, it is a mechanism of support that also requires support, just like any other means of caring for children. It also is important to point out that although there are relatively high levels of discrimination and stigma and abuse that are reported in kinship care settings, these levels of abuse are pretty consistent with reported levels of violence in all family settings across the continent. So it's important to contextualize that reporting. I guess this is where it's important to move into the kinds of support that are required for families. And that's because, for the most part, kinship care, because it is understood to be such an ordinary form of caring for children, it's typically neglected. It's mentioned as important, but it doesn't get the kind of targeted investments or attention that many other components of alternative care do, for example, institutionalization and other forms of residential care. Yet it's quite obvious that kinship carers and the children in their care need support. Now, when we talk about what kinds of support are needed, this is something that other speakers in the webinar are going to address, but I think it's important just to mention that there are some commonalities across the forms of kinship care and across the region that have emerged as being really important. First of all, of course, is poverty alleviation, enabling those people who are providing care to children to provide the kind of quality of care that they want to provide, also through access to services and social protection. And then there is an issue in relation to emotional support for children. We know that children whose parents have died or for whom they are separated can feel great levels of distress, anguish, and difficulty, and often need the support not only of caregivers in the household, but of other children in the household, other adults, and from a broader network of peers. Similarly, those who are providing care to these children, caregivers, have a range of practical and emotional supports that they require, which are often not met. And many caregivers feel alone and very challenged to provide the quality of care that they want to provide. Similarly, as I mentioned, in terms of the risks that children face in kinship care, as they do in many other forms of care, to violence and abuse and neglect, child protection supports are often required, as they are in other settings. Finally, we know that kinship care is a mechanism for support in ordinary times, but also in times of crisis. For example, during the HIV/AIDS pandemic, during the Ebola crisis in West Africa, and most recently in the context of COVID-19. We know that families and friends of family often step in immediately to support children, but these families need support to do so in the way that is required. What this research revealed in terms of the means of supporting kinship care in different settings, the first is to undertake research that really understands much more clearly how children understand their experiences of kinship care, to what extent has it shaped their perspective on life, how do they see themselves in relation to others, in relation to their future, to their access to family networks, etc. This take on the experience of kinship care from the perspective of children is very much lacking and very much required in order to ensure that it's a mechanism that truly supports children. The second is to change national policy and interventions so that they prioritize support for safe and effective kinship care. That doesn't mean ignoring the other mechanisms of alternative care, but really making sure that you've done everything you can to support kinship care before investing in other mechanisms of support, such as foster care. And then it's looking across the range of legislation and policy that governments put in place and the kinds of programs that CSOs and NGOs have implemented to ensure that kinship care is considered across these interventions, for example, through social protection. And then to expand global campaigning so that the focus on alternative care continues to be on deinstitutionalization, but that much greater emphasis is placed on the importance and the value of this Indigenous mechanism of family support, which is called kinship care. And to do so, we need to include everybody at the table, including national CSOs. That is it for me. I think it's really probably obvious from what I've said how strong I believe this mechanism of care is and can be, and that I believe it's really too valuable a resource to be neglected. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gillian. Thank you. That was a really fantastic presentation. What I'm going to do now is just to follow up on that presentation, just to let you all know that in the chat box, Bertha has kindly posted a link to a Google form, a Google Drive folder, and you can use that to access the PowerPoint. And I've also shared a link to the report that the presentation is based on. And I think that report may be in different languages as well, because Family for Every Child are usually quite good at that translation. So just before we move on to the panel discussion, after Family for Every Child commissioned and after we carried out that research for Family for Every Child, they decided that the next key step would be to develop some new global guidance on kinship care. So the research that Gillian was referencing was really trying to understand the situation of kinship carers. And the guidance is really about trying to outline in much more detail about what can be done to support kinship care. So I just wanted to welcome Gemma Gillam onto the call. And Gemma, can you just tell us a little bit more about this guidance and what is it, how it's developed, and also how others, those that are on the call, can maybe help with and contribute to the development of the guidance. If we still have Gemma on the call, yeah, go ahead, Gemma.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Great, thanks, Emily, and Mona and Gillian as well. As mentioned, so Family for Every Child are in the process of coordinating the development of some global interagency guidance. This is an outcome of the research that we conducted, understanding why kinship care is so important to children and families. And this is really about now looking at how do we support kinship care to ensure the best possible outcome for children. So the purpose of this guidance is to convince governments, UN agencies and NGOs about the need to prioritise support to kinship care and outline the key components of this support, providing examples of promising practice. As the guidance will be global, it will be looking at a wide range of contexts and factors and provide an initial framework for practitioners to then adapt to their local context and the realities of the families that they're working with. So inside this guidance, we'll be including what are the enabling environments to support kinship care, services and support for kinship care, dilemmas in supporting kinship care, as well as what support needs to look like for particular groups. In order to develop this guidance, we've established an interagency drafting committee, which has approximately 12 members, and we're conducting a literature review, virtual practitioner workshops, key informant interviews with practitioners, and national level face-to-face workshops and consultations with children and caregivers. We have a digital kinship care community made up of practitioners working on kinship care, and we will be using this space as our referencing committee for the project. If you're interested in being involved in any way, please do join this community, as we'll continue to share opportunities for engagement through this space, including an online event learning series, sharing some of the findings that are emerging from the research, and as well as an opportunity to comment on the draft of the guidance. I'm going to share a link to this digital community in the chat once I've finished. And then finally, if you do have any resources or examples of promising practice that you think could benefit this process, please do reach out to Emily and I, as we're really keen for this to be a practitioner-led and informed process. Thank you again, and I hope to engage with you all further on this project going forward.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Gemma. I shared a link already to the Changemakers platform, but if you can do it again, that would be brilliant. And I encourage everyone to join that community, because I think there's going to be loads of opportunities coming up in the next 6 months or so to, there'll be a whole series of webinars just on kinship care, and I'll start sharing lots of the resources that we come across around kinship care as well. So it's a really great opportunity to share learning. Right, we are now going to have a panel discussion where I'm going to ask 4 panelists a series of questions around good practice in relation to kinship care. And while the panelists are speaking, if you have questions for them or for Gillian, please feel free to list them in the chat box, and we'll try and have enough time to come to all of those questions at the end. So first of all, just to introduce the panel, we are delighted to have with us Alfred Murigi, who's the Assistant Director of the Directorate of Children's Services in Kenya. So you're very welcome, Alfred. We're very pleased to have you with us. We also have Khadija Karama from Changing the Way We Care in Kenya. We have Blessing Mutama from FOST in Zimbabwe, and Suzanne Kulu from Cindy in South Africa. So it's really great to have you all on this call. I'm going to start off with Alfred from the Directorate of Children's Services. Are you able to put your video on, Alfred? Or at least, I just want to check you're still able to speak. I know you were having some connectivity issues earlier. Can you hear me okay, Alfred?
Yes, I can hear you.
There we can see you. Perfect. Thank you. We're so appreciative that you were able to join the call today. I know that in Kenya, a lot of effort has gone into developing really excellent legislation and guidance around children's alternative care. Could you tell us a bit about how kinship care is incorporated into your legislation, your strategic plan? I know you have a really fantastic and comprehensive strategy on alternative care, and also in your new case management guidance, your new SOPs on alternative and family and community-based care in Kenya.
So thank you very much. A lot has happened in the Kenyan front in the area of kinship care. And I just want to make reference to a few legislative policies, beginning with the UNCRC, which is so obvious that in Article number 9, subsection 1, talks about and acknowledges the role and responsibility of families to take care of their children. Also, we have borrowed heavily on the African Charter for the Rights and Welfare of the Child. In the African Charter, Article number 19 is very clear about prioritizing of family-based care, which generally speaks of kinship. Also, when you look at the Constitution of Kenya, 2010, Article 53, it entitles every child to parental care and protection. I also want to make reference to a new piece of legislation, and that is the Children Act 2022, which was enacted in July 26th this year. And in section 11, subsection 4, in the Children Act, it guarantees children to live and be cared for by their parents. So we have a piece of legislation that we make reference to. I also want to add that we also have a care reform strategy, which was developed and launched early this year. And this strategy is a policy document that supports the care of children. And when you look at this care reform strategy, it has 3 pillars. The first pillar is on prevention of separation and family strengthening. Second is coming up with robust alternative family care placements, which encourages placement into kinship care, kafala, guardianship, adoption, and all those traditional approaches to care. Then the third pillar is tracing, reintegration, and transitioning to family and community-based care. This is the most important pillar because it introduces aspects of proper case management for children during the process of reintegration. It brings about support for children and aftercare services, and also introduces a component of redirection of resources. Redirection of resources which previously were being used in the care of children in residential care. I also want to make reference to the guidelines for alternative family care for children in Kenya. These guidelines, which were developed in the year 2014, actually really supported Kenya's move and development towards issues of taking care of children within the family and the community. When you look at these guidelines, they have borrowed heavily from the UN guidelines for children. And the main purpose of this guideline is to ensure that in cases where permanent solutions for children are not possible, then in the best interest of the children, suitable alternative care options are provided for children. We also have other pieces of legislation like the Children Policy of 2015. We have developed standard operating procedures for alternative family care. And these SOPs ideally guide caseworkers on how to standardize implementation of the care options in Kenya. So I would say generally that a lot has been done in this sphere of taking care of children within the alternative family care context.
Thank you so much. It's such an impressive range of different strategies and guidance that you've developed, right from the overarching strategic plan describing what you're going to be focusing on in relation to children's care, right down to the SOPs, which are helping social workers to actually deliver on promoting alternative care and particularly promoting kinship care. So I would urge everyone to have a look for some of those documents, and those that are publicly available. We have a folder, perhaps Bertha can post it again, a Google Drive folder where we're putting the PowerPoints, and we'll try and share some of those documents from Kenya. So thank you so much. That was really a really helpful introduction. I'm going to turn now to Khadija from Changing the Way We Care, who I hope is available. Are you there, Khadija? Oh.
Yes, I'm around.
Oh, good. Well, I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you, Khadija. The line isn't brilliant. Let's try again and see what happens.
Sure, can you hear me okay now?
Yes, that's much better.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Right.
So, Khadija, can you tell me, I know that Changing the Way We Care has been involved in supporting the reintegration of children from residential care back to their families. And often, very often, I think in quite a large proportion of cases, children were sent to live with their grandparents or other relatives. Could you tell us a bit about how it's different supporting children who are going back to live with grandparents compared to supporting children who might be going back to live with parents? Thanks. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily, and of course, let me also appreciate my colleague from the government, Mr. Murigi, for starting us off. So I would also want to talk through my experience with regards to COVID, because that is where we really now felt the experience of reintegration. Because of the different memos, the different guidance that were put forward in efforts to contain the spread of COVID. So one of the things that really caught us off guard is the lack of preparation for both children and the caregivers to where they were going back to. And from the initial studies that we did in terms of understanding the impact of COVID on caregivers and children, kinship stood out to be, one of the most common form of alternative form of care, family care, where children went back. At least 80% of those children really had someone to go back to. And then we went further to do an analysis to understand the age distribution. And honestly, a huge number, I'm sorry, I don't have the figures on my fingertip, but really shows that a good number of the caregivers were literally grandparents. there could be other reasons, because we are in piloting in areas where they have different geographical context in terms of also disease and epidemics. So lots of things really affecting grandparents. But one of the things that we realize is that there's a lot of, from even relating it to what was presented initially, the issue of financial economic support to grandparents really came out as one of, the findings. The willingness is there, like 100%. They loved, they wanted to see, to support their grandchildren. They were very happy to have them. I think for them, it was also like a form of a support system for them as grandparents, rather than staying alone or staying with some of their grandchildren. But then one of the asks was, things are not easy, things are tough. If we could really be boosted or supported in one way or the other in terms of contribute to stability of the family, then to a greater extent, we would see that there's sustainable integration. One of the other aspects is really awareness on where to access social services. They are there, but then really trying to get to understand where to access them has been an issue. I think this not only for children who have been in kinship care under grandparents, but also for any other kind of kinship care. So they would know about the services, but then the how of really accessing those services, or they may know how to access those services, but then the modalities of getting there. An example is caregivers who are supporting children with disability. Lots of challenges that are really facing around access to these targeted support services for children living with disability or caregivers living with disability. Then issues around parenting. The way grandparents do care for their children is really very different from how maybe an aunt, an uncle, even a biological parent would do it, So we actually saw the importance of contextualizing some of these messaging around parenting in terms of improving their communication with the children that they have received, in terms of how can they support, because if you have a child who is in school and here you have a grandparent who is illiterate, then how do you bring the two together so that even the child feels, I have this adult caregiver who really cares for me, she is even supporting. So different kinds of support really skewed towards grandparent. But I think we have really learned through it, and there's a general feeling that there's some things that really need to be standardized, to be contextualized for them to fit into kinship care for children who end up in situations where they're supported by their grandparents. Their situation is somewhat unique, and there are things that really need to be tailored to some extent, where we felt like, can we reach out to organizations that are handling, they're offering geriatric care? What are some of these unique things that we can do for grandparents for them to be really, brought up to that level where even children fell part? But generally, the children who went back to live with their grandparents, they were very happy. They really loved being there. I mean, we know when we all go back to our grandparents and we feel like, wow, this is the best place to be. But then on the other hand, there's a lot of name them psychosocial support that is needed for the grandparents, economic support for the grandparents, parenting support for the grandparents, and even medical, because some of them you'd find they're very elderly and they have an existing condition that they themselves need to be supported with for them to be able to take care of the children that they're taking care in the household. Yeah, so let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And I think your experiences in Kenya probably reflect experiences elsewhere in the region and indeed across the world about how, although you may have family strengthening programs that are designed to help all families, really kinship carers, particularly grandparent carers, have a kind of unique set of needs. They're older, they're poorer, they have health needs. They're not used to accessing services for children because they haven't done it for years. There may be generational gaps between them and the children they're caring for, which require particular parenting, support and interventions. So for all of those reasons, you can't just expect, I think, generic kind of family strengthening programs to work with those caregivers without adaptations. Fantastic, thank you. So we're going to go on now to Fost in Zimbabwe and Blessing. Blessing, are you there?
Yes, thanks very much.
Great. Oh,
yes,
it's great to see you. So FOST is an NGO in Zimbabwe that's been doing some really, really fantastic work on kinship care, lots of different things on kinship care. But I'm going to ask FOST to speak, I'm going to ask Blessing to speak in particular about the support groups that you've set up for kinship carers and children in kinship care. And if you can tell us about why you set those groups up and what kinds of support that they offer, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So yeah, thanks. Maybe linking to our research that highlighted that support for children and caregivers in kinship care have not been really supported. You know, we have seen a huge gap, and this can actually be linked to gaps that are related to policy and practice here in Zimbabwe. So what we have done as an organization is we have established what we call support groups for caregivers. We've got children who are in kinship care, and the majority of the caregivers are actually grannies. And I think Khadija was just highlighting, you know, the mammoth, you know, challenges that these grannies face in trying to provide and support the children that they are staying with. So basically, these support groups, you know, they meet once or twice a month to provide each other with peer support. And for us, these groups have actually become a strong base for the provision of community-based psychosocial support for caregivers. I think Khadija just highlighted, you know, the need for psychosocial support for the grannies or the households that are taking care of children who are in kinship care. So we have seen caregivers accessing, you know, emotional support within those groups, and the majority of the caregivers that are within these groups, we realized that they experience a lot of burnout in trying to provide care and support for the children that they are looking after. In particular, you know, the grandparents, you know, they face a lot of challenges due to issues of generational gaps that were just highlighted by Khadija, and later alone, you know, the economic hardships, you know, that we are facing, you know, as a countries, you know, these are compounded and they make it difficult for them to provide adequate care for the children that they are looking after. The grannies, again, if we look at them, you know, they become parents again. You know, they were parents in the past, and now in the future, you know, they've suddenly become, you know, parents in a different time. And understanding the dynamics is actually a challenge. And what we have done, we are implementing parenting skills trainings and discussions within these groups so that they're able to understand, you know, the children that they are taking care of. And the way, you know, they provide care, they used to provide care then, you know, sometimes is then translated as abuse by the children that they are now taking care of, you know, these days, you know, because of the issues around, you know, children's rights, depending on how, you know, children are being taught about children's rights. Sometimes, you know, children can translate things like life skills as abuse. So all these challenges, you know, they come together and discuss on, you know, what methods can they use in trying to avoid, you know, some of these challenges. Whilst, you know, kinship care is the most preferred form of alternative care by children and caregivers, we've had cases of children, you know, complaining of, like just I've said, having been abused, you know, within kinship care by the caregivers that are taking care of them. And I think for some, like in some discussions that we have had with the community, when we have community dialogues, they say sometimes it's difficult for someone to provide the same love that they can provide to their biological child. So these are some of the issues, that we try and discuss, with the caregivers within these groups. Then we also do a lot of household economic strengthening as part of our programming with these groups, where we have witnessed separation of children and their families, and even challenges in reintegration of children with their relatives, actually resulting from economic difficulties. So most, if not all of the children that are in the kinship households that we are supporting, they live, below the poverty datum line, and they find it difficult to fend for the families. So we are doing income generating activities with these groups so that we are able to build their capacities to provide for their own children. And some of the activities that we are implementing with them include income saving and lending activities. And through these ISALs, we encourage them to start small businesses so that they're able, to provide for the family using those small businesses, not from the ISOs. And as their, income within the ISOs grows, we also want them to grow, because if they're able to borrow more money from the ISOs, they should be able to, to grow their businesses. So if they started selling tomatoes, as they borrow more money from the ISOs, they should be able to start selling clothes, so that they also, get more profit to support, their families. Then we also have poultry projects. And because most of the households that we are supporting, they don't have land, we do low input gardening with them, so that they're also able to provide, vegetables, for the families. So we've seen this helping the families to meet their day-to-day needs for the children. And we've seen grannies and they are also being able to pay for school fees, because sometimes we find we pay school fees for 2 or 3 children within the household, and maybe a granny is looking after 13 children. So they're able to pay, school fees for the other children within the households, which for us is provides, ownership, and it's a sustainable way of taking care of the children. Then lastly, we are actually working on a movement for grannies in Zimbabwe, which will help, them to lobby and advocate for support for kinship care, looking at pushing, policy reviews. And what we will be doing is annually we'll be providing a platform where, all the grannies from all the ends in Zimbabwe will come together, and will then invite policymakers so that, they have dialogue, and discuss about the challenges that they are facing. So yeah, this is what we are currently doing here in Zimbabwe as FOST, in building capacity and supporting, the support groups of the families that we are supporting here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Blessing. That was a very clear and really great example. I mean, I think what your example is showing how the needs of kinship carers are really multifaceted. There's so many different areas where they need support with poverty alleviation and all of those areas around parenting. And I think what's really great and what Foster's done is really base their support on what the caregivers are asking for. So that's really wonderful. And I love the fact that you're building this movement. So taking those experiences up to government and trying to influence government policy from the perspective of the grandmothers. That's brilliant. Thanks so much. And we've got lots of questions coming in, but before we just go on to those questions, we've got one last question for our panel, which is to Suzanne from Cindy in South Africa. So welcome, Suzanne. Nice to see you.
Thanks,
I know that poverty is a common problem that kinship carers face. Could you tell us a bit about how social protection has been provided to this group in South Africa? And what have been some of the challenges and some of the lessons learned through your experiences in South Africa?
Yeah, so I think in South Africa, we've learned some really important lessons about the degree of formalization for kinship care, and also which system is perhaps the most appropriate to use in specific contexts. So in the early 2000s, mostly as a result of the growing number of children living in kinship care because of the HIV pandemic, kinship carers were encouraged to access the child protection system, our foster care system, as a means of getting more adequate support financially. And what happened as a result of that is we saw a rapid increase in the number of children entering that system. And the foster care system in South Africa is very highly regulated. It requires quite intense social work. It requires the involvement of the court. And it requires the extension of foster care placements from every 6 months to every 2 years, depending on what the magistrate orders. And so there are many checks and balances within that system to ensure the child is protected. And the result of including so many additional children who were perhaps already living in kinship care and had been living in stable kinship care placements for a number of years was that suddenly that system became overburdened administratively, and social workers found themselves filling in a lot of paperwork and going back to court to renew placements, and they weren't able to respond to child protection cases as they hoped. And so we hit a sort of crisis situation in South Africa. And as a result, the government started to look at how they could find a more permanent solution and address this crisis within the foster care system. We tried to increase the number of social workers, but it didn't actually help with the administrative overburdening of the system. So what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years is there's been a process to change our policy to allow for the introduction of a new kinship care grant. And this grant will allow kinship caregivers to access the social protection that they need through a much more simplified administrative system that does not require the input of a social worker, and it does not require the input of the court. And the idea will be then that the child protection system will be more freed up to be responsive to child protection needs, including for children living in kinship care. But it will also mean that kinship caregivers who were not able to access the foster care system because it was so overburdened and because placements were taking 2 years, sometimes 5 years, even in the worst case scenarios, those kinship caregivers will now have the financial cash transfers that they need to better support the children that they're caring for. Yeah, so that's kind of how we've looked now at the different degrees of formalization and some of the lessons that we've learned in South Africa about, in some ways, over-formalizing kinship care placements, and looking and exploring different options of how we can improve the responsiveness of our system to children and caregivers.
Thank you so much. I think the example from South Africa really does provide lessons learned for elsewhere in the region. I think this a lot of people have this dilemma. It's a question we often get asked when we're working on kinship care about how much do kinship carers need to be monitored and regulated. And in South Africa, it's shown if you do that too much, you end up completely overwhelming your system. And certainly, I think it demonstrates that if you want kinship carers to have access to social protection, it shouldn't be contingent on them becoming registered with social services and part of the child protection system. It should be based on their financial needs and the need to support those needs. Thanks, Suzanne. Right, we've got a load of questions. So the first one was around for Mr. Murigi. I think you're still with us. Yes, I can see that you are. Around how we can ensure that the policies and documentation that have been developed have been operationalized. And I know that you answered briefly in the chat box, but it'd be great to hear a bit more about how you've gone about that in Kenya in operationalizing the various different policies and strategies that you've developed in relation to kinship care.
Thank you. The situation in Kenya, we decided to take a different approach, and we made a decision to pilot the implementation of these care options, and one county in particular was identified, and that county is on the western side of the country, and that is Kisumu County. And basically it was identified because it had a high preference of HIV/AIDS, and there were so many orphans within that region. So the pilot started around the year 2018, and by the year 2019, it was decided that we scale up to 4 new counties, and 4 new counties were identified as demonstration counties. So basically, the country decided to pilot implementation instead of doing the implementation countrywide. And we have so many lessons from these pilot and demonstration counties. And some of the most important lesson we learned is that actually children can be taken care of within the family context and within the community environment. And all these care options that were developed, we developed something that we call the continuum of care, which was able to show the different or various levels where children can be given support either through the family-based environment, the community, or residential care. So for Kenya, I would say that moving into the pilot was very important because we were testing the waters, and we confirmed that actually our documentation can work. And what really supported us was usage of proper case management for integration package element. We realized that for us to have successful reintegration of children within family and community, proper case management was critical. So as we speak, we have a critical mass of child practitioners. We have lay volunteers. We have people we call lay counselors. We have community structures that were developed to support this initiative. So ours is actually a bottom-up approach, where the community is handling issues, and those issues that are difficult cascade upwards for direction. So I would say that apart from the documentation, we have also implemented, and currently we are actually rolling out countrywide. Thank you.
Thanks so much. You raised so many interesting points there, but I think your last point, I particularly wanted to emphasize the real importance of community engagement in supporting and in some cases monitoring kinship care. I think it's particularly fits kinship care well, having that engagement with community volunteers. Fantastic, thank you. The next question was around examples of support to kinship care in emergency contexts. So I don't know if any of our panelists or perhaps Gillian from the research have any particular examples that came up that they'd like to share. Okay. Well, I
can jump in here for a minute.
Please go ahead. Please go ahead, Gillian. That'd be great.
I think I see Mwansa here from UNICEF UNICEF Zambia.
She is on the call, yeah.
And maybe Mwansa, you want to share what was done with the cash transfers in the context of COVID-19 in 2020.
Mwansa, do you want to jump in there?
Hi, Gillian. Hi, Emily.
Putting you on the spot a bit, but we'd love to hear about that. Please go ahead. It's great to have you on the call.
Thank you. So for Zambia, what happened during the COVID-19 was the government had and the UN and other partners mobilized resources for the emergency cash transfers. So there was a window to sort of broaden. There was what was being called the horizontal expansion. So there was an opportunity for us to bring in children who were transitioning from care or had already been transitioned from institutional care to family-based, either reintegrated with their biological families, that is birth families, or placed into kinship care. So that was a group and criteria defined on how then those would access that emergency support during that period. So it was it proved to be helpful at the time. And some families have actually bounced back better in the sense that they've been able to generate income for the family even up to now for some families. And as a result of that, government is looking into having, like South Africa was sharing, having a group, that criteria as part of their standard social cash transfer program as part of the social protection program in Zambia. It's still under discussion, but it provided some lessons in terms of how do you support those children that are placed under kinship care as a result of statutory intervention and not as a result of families agreeing laterally, like the informal one, but the one that sort of fall into the formal system. Yeah. So I think from Zambia, in a nutshell, that is how the emergency response was tackled during the COVID. Over.
Thanks.
I hope I answered it well.
You did it beautifully. Despite having no warning that we were going to call on you. That's so great. It's always good to bring in lots of expertise from across the region. I'm trying to mute people as they we're hearing quite a lot of interference. I'm trying to mute people as they start speaking, but if you can just try and keep yourselves on mute, that would be fantastic. We have so many people on the call. It's
maybe if I can.
Yes, please go ahead, Blessing. Please go ahead. That'd be great.
If I can just add, one of the things that we also found important during emergencies, particularly these households that we are working with, one, because they are in remote areas and hard to reach areas. Sometimes in terms of information, they're the last people to get the information. And sometimes the information that they get, sometimes it would have been translated in a wrong way. So what we have done as an organization was to try and make sure that we provide them with accurate, correct information, around COVID. And we had our staff, like during COVID, most organizations, they were banned from operating. I think that's why you'd realize that there were quite a number of abuses that happened during COVID. At the end of COVID, we had a number of girls who were impregnated. But as for us as an organization, we were given a special clearance by the government so that we could monitor, what was happening in the communities. So, we could visit families, talk to them, about what was happening. So for us, I think it helped to bring, better results. Although, yes, in the end, we had quite a number of children who were impregnated here and there. But for us, providing, correct and consistent information really helped during the emergencies. Yeah.
And those issues around sort of sexual and reproductive health and early pregnancy do often come up in kinship care households. I've seen that emerge in lots of other countries as well, perhaps linked to high degrees of poverty or these generational gaps which make it harder for kinship carers to speak to the children they care about those issues. So I think that's another area that we need to consider. Thank you so much for that. Okay, there were a couple of requests for information on empowering parents, preventing separation, and looking at kind of community-based care and supports for vulnerable children. So just to say that not the next webinar, but the one after that will be on prevention. And as well as all of our webinars, we also have a newsletter that goes out every month. And that also, we also try and look at that thematically. So we'll also have a newsletter around prevention. And last month's newsletter was looking at some of the kind of community-based mechanisms that are used in Rwanda. And all of those newsletters can be found on the Better Care Network site if you want to look at past copies of those. So there are some questions around how we kind of monitor kinship carers and ensure that abuse and violence is not happening in those homes. And I think linked to that, I'm just going to try and go back up to this question because I think it was put really nicely. How can we strike a balance between recognising kinship care in legislation and providing support to kinship care? So there's this concern that this spirit of volunteerism, of people volunteering spontaneously to support families, which is the driving force in relation to kinship care, might be lost if we impose too much monitoring and regulation on kinship care. So I don't know, maybe starting with you, Suzanne, if you could maybe reflect on that from the South African experience, then I might come back to Fost, to you, Blessing, and Fost and Khadija on that question. Suzanne, would you feel happy to give that a go?
I can try. So maybe just to share that actually this last week I was chatting to a social worker. I was interviewing her around some other kinship care work we're doing, and she has been working for this child. I've been familiar with her working there, and she is in charge of kinship care placements. And I asked her I think she has a caseload of around 200 placements. Of that caseload, in her 8 to 9 years of working there, how often has she come across a serious child protection referral within those kinship care placements? And she said perhaps 2 or 3 in those 9 years. So I do think there is there's this tension that we hold in understanding that children outside of parental care are more vulnerable, but I don't think we can assume that just because children are in kinship care, they are going to be abused. And so I think it's holding that tension. I also think it's about recognizing that this is something that is normative and culturally normative, and that there are many strengths to kinship care. And that the more we make caregivers feel watched or monitored by a system, the less we make that placement feel natural and like a normal form of care. So I think it's really important to make sure that we strike that balance. And I think around the issues of volunteerism, of the kinship carers that we've spoken to in our research, all of them want to provide this care because they have love for the children within their family, because it's something that they know is common within their culture, and they value that supportive care. So, but at the same time, it is stressful. It's stressful to add additional children to your household if you're already struggling financially, if you're already coming from situations of low economic context. So it's trying to make sure that we don't just assume that people can add this additional financial burden. Yes, there's the emotional side of it that people are willing to give, but there is also a financial burden that comes with it. And so how do we support those caregivers so that they're not additionally stressed? Because stressed caregivers don't provide the best form of care. When you're stressed, you're not at your best caregiving capacity. And so it's trying to balance all of those dynamics. I don't think I've really answered the question, but I think I've just, yeah.
You've answered it beautifully.
I've raised
Thank
awareness.
you. I think one of the things you said made me remember how important it is to recognise all these different forms of kinship care, and how the need to monitor or check in on kinship carers varies greatly, kind of by form, but also case by case. So we know, for example, if children are living with very distant relatives, or perhaps with friends of the family, people that they don't know so well, they might need a bit more regulation than a child that's going to live with a grandmother who they know extremely well. So I think those are some of the things we might need to consider. It's not like a one size fits all. Blessing, did you want to add anything on that, or Khadija? Yeah, go ahead, Blessing.
Yeah, sure. Monitoring of children in kinship care came out as an issue during our research and even during our work. Was like generally like what you were saying, you know, when it comes to like reintegration of children, when a child is moved from one household to a place of placement, it's a private thing that is done, you know, by relative. But how do we then follow up to see whether where the child was placed, the child is not being abused? It's something else. And that's when we've had cases of children being made housemaids, you know, being asked to go and look after the cattle, while these children are supposed to be in school. So for us in Zimbabwe, yes, we do have a case management system that we have, but already it is overburdened. Because if Suzanne still recalls when she came to Zimbabwe, when we had a training which was focusing on reintegration of children in kinship care, one of the things that came up was the social workers who are responsible for case management. their ratio in terms of the children that they support, you find one social worker supporting thousands of children, of which in real terms, it's not even possible when you look at quality of support, that is then needed for those children, even in terms of following up on those children. So currently what we are doing here in Zimbabwe, we have engaged with the government. Like recently we reviewed a policy on children. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to have them include kinship care, within that policy. Why? Because we want to come up with guidelines that would then specify on how children in kinship care can be monitored, how children in kinship care can be supported. Because you'd realize that we do have NGOs that are supporting, children. How can they come in? Like Foster's got social workers. How can the registered social workers that Foster's employed come in, to assist or complement what the government is doing? And we do have what we call community-based case care workers that are in the community. And basically they are paraprofessionals working under the Department of Social Welfare. But how can they come in, to assist in terms of monitoring, these children that are in kinship care as part of the case management? Yeah.
Oh, that's such a great point, Blessing, because I think that kind of lighter touch monitoring might be more appropriate for kinship care situations, having other people in the community or they already have a relationship with and they don't feel judged by, just keeping an eye on things and seeing if everything's going okay. And if they have concerns, then they can escalate it to a more professional social worker and take it up into the child protection system. But starting with an approach that's supportive rather than, policing, I think is very important. Yeah, thank you. Khadija, did you want to add anything on that issue? Well, Khadija, I'm not sure. We'll maybe move on and we can come back to what Khadija would like to add anything. So we're having a lot of comments in the chat box, so I urge you to kind of have a look through those. But some of the things that are being raised are around the real importance of linking kinship care into the social protection system. So making sure that kinship carers have access to that system. Somebody asked a question earlier about kinship care in emergency contexts, and Mwanza was able to provide. Oh, Khadija, yeah, go ahead.
I think it would be great to really the issue.
Oh, Khadija, I'm sorry, we're having a few issues with the quality of your line. I'm so sorry. We'll try and come back to you in a second and see if it's improved. I was talking about the link to the social protection system and the importance of that. We did do a publication which is available. I think Bertha's going to be putting up the links to the UNICEF Asaro webpage, which has all of our publications on. We did one on social protection, and you'll see in that there's reference to some social protection systems in emergency settings where they work to ensure that if a family is taking an additional child in, that they get extra food rations or extra cash grants to reflect the fact that they have extra mouth to feed. So that's quite a good example here. And that paper on social protection, one person was also asking about more mainstream social protection programs, larger, I guess, government cash transfers, and how they represent and consider kinship care. So that also makes a little bit of reference to that in that paper. Okay, let me just see if we've got any more questions, because we're just coming to the end. Khadija was saying her internet is a bit problematic, so she's going to try and add something on the monitoring and reporting aspect in the chat box. Thank you. So
hi, Emily. I can try to quickly respond if that's okay.
Yeah,
time
please
allows.
go ahead. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sorry. So we did recognize the importance of monitoring and reporting.
Oh, Khadija, I'm so sorry. Perhaps you can type it in the chat box, because we've only got a few minutes left anyway, and your line is going all problematic. Yeah. So I'm sorry about that. Khadija, I think we're going to have to give up, because we've only got 5 minutes left anyway. So perhaps if you can just type your response in the chat box.
She's still speaking.
Yes. Okay. I'm okay.
No.
I'm not sure she can hear us, but I'll just put her on mute for now, and then we can
also
okay. Sorry, Khadija, I'm so sorry. We're having some technical issues, so we're going to move on. But if you can write down your answers in the chat box. We've just got another 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to hand back over to Mona now, and just to wrap up the webinar and to explain about the next sessions that we're going to have. But just before I do, thanks so much to all of the contributors today. Thanks to you for the presentations, for your contributions to the panel discussion, and for all of those for joining us. I think it's been a really, really helpful discussion. While Mona is speaking, Bertha is going to be frantically putting things in the chat box. So if you could just keep an eye on that. We've got a survey we'd like you to complete, and some resources that we want to share with you. So just keep an eye on the chat box while Mona is talking. Over to you, Mona. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Emily, for facilitating the panel discussion, and also for preparing for this webinar in terms of this panelists and the speakers that managed to join us today. I would also want to say that what a rich and informative webinar session we've had today. Clearly, from what we've heard, we see that kinship care works. There is a need to support the unique needs of each household that is providing these services to children, and also the need to understand at a country perspective, who are the kinship carers? Are they the grandparents, as we've heard from Zimbabwe? Is it a mix of younger people, younger generations? Are they other households who are headed by other children? So we need to know in terms of the actual situation of each household and the kinship carer in place. And most importantly, how can we also extend support, provide follow-up, and even link the kinship carers or kinship families with services that can also alleviate poverty and many other concerns that households are faced with. With that, I would like to thank Gillian for the initial opening and the presentation, and Gemma for sharing with us the guideline that is in place. All the resources, as Emily has mentioned, are in the chat box. So take a look, and we will also share this by email at the end of this webinar. I'd also like to extend appreciation to the government of Kenya for providing insight of the enabling environment in Kenya for family-based care for all children, and the different pilots that are in place to ensure that kinship care and other form of family-based care are working. Thanking Changing the Way We Care Kenya also for adding more examples of what they managed to do in terms of COVID-19 and beyond. And those examples were very rich, and apologies that we couldn't hear you towards the end, but please share with us your insight in the chat box if time allows. Thanking you, Blessing of Zimbabwe, for giving us the example of what your organization is doing in terms of providing kinship care to families. I thought the Grannies program that is in place is impressive, and how this intergenerational parenting is unique and needs to be supported based on the various needs each household may require. And last but not least, to you, Susan of Cindy of South Africa. Thank you for also giving us another dimension. Being in East and Southern Africa region, we see how countries are very different, of course, but also the middle income countries having more advanced systems and workforce in place, much better compared to the other region, and how those are working, and how we can also learn, and also what's not working to be able to improve all the learning. So with that, I thank you also, dear participants, for managing to join us. You know, we've had a good number throughout the webinar. I initially started off by having at least 55 plus participants, and now we have about 40, a little bit over 40 participants still with us. So thanking you for making the time. So before we final closure of this webinar, we would really like to get some feedback from you, dear participants, on how this platform has been running, so that we can promote it amongst, you know, our partners such as donors and so forth, on how best we can improve it. There is a link to a short survey that Bertha has placed that link. Maybe Bertha, if you can just place it now so that it's clear that this is the link to the survey. And please click on that link and take and complete those questions that are there. This should take you about 5 minutes. So we want your feedback on this platform for those that are just joining in today, but those also for those who have been joining us throughout the years, the 2 years that we have been running this platform. We want to hear from you. We want to see how best we can improve into phase 3, as phase 2 is almost coming to an end in January 2023. The rest of the materials that have been put in the chat box are first, you know, newly published or released 2 new videos, video resources on lessons learned on care reform during COVID-19. And also we have a very interesting video of on an introduction to care reform. So please take a look at our YouTube channel, that the 2 links to these 2 resources have been shared, video resources. And I think also the link to the UNICEF website has also been shared. This is still work in progress. We have a dedicated page on the UNICEF SRO website specifically for this learning platform on childcare reform. And we are still in the process of uploading various resources. So we do encourage you to also take a look at the UNICEF link, website link that has been posted and should be posted now, again, for you to access the various materials, and also most importantly, share with your respective governments and partners working in the area of care. And lastly, in terms of the announcement, our next webinar will be on reintegration of children into family-based care. And this webinar on reintegration will take place in early December. We haven't yet set a date, but that will be done soon, and we'll share, you know, updates again by email and through the newsletter, where you'll know when exactly the webinar will be. When it will take place. And of course, we will also make the simultaneous interpretations available, both in French and Portuguese. So lastly, but not least, thanking all colleagues that managed to join us from other regions like West and Central Africa and beyond, and all the various speakers that are with us today. So with that, I thank you all very much. The webinar recording will be made available, and we will share this by email. Thank you and have a good afternoon.